The fluorescent lights of Terminal B buzzed overhead as Rebecca Chen wheeled her black suitcase through the security checkpoint at Denver International Airport. Her flight to Portland had been delayed by 3 hours, and the waiting area stretched before her like a maze of uncomfortable chairs and overpriced coffee shops. What caught her attention, however, was not another delayed passenger or crying child, but the gleaming black piano sitting in the center of the departure lounge, like an island of possibility in a sea of frustrated travelers. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Marcus Williams had been walking the same corridors of Denver International Airport for 12 years. His black security uniform was pressed and clean, his radio clipped to his shoulder, and his heavy boots made steady sounds against the polished floor. At 55 years old, Marcus had seen everything an airport could offer. Crying families saying goodbye, excited travelers heading to adventures, business people rushing to important meetings, and countless others living their lives in transit. But Marcus rarely noticed the individuals anymore. To him, the passengers were just numbers moving through his domain. His job was simple: keep everyone safe, maintain order, and make sure the rules were followed. The rules were everything to Marcus. They gave structure to chaos and meaning to his days. Marcus lived alone in a small apartment 20 minutes from the airport. His wife Sarah had passed away 8 years ago from cancer, and their daughter Emma lived across the country in Boston with her own family. Emma called every Sunday, but the conversations were always the same. Work was fine, the weather was okay. How were the grandchildren? Marcus loved his daughter, but he struggled to connect with her world of soccer practices, school plays, and family dinners. His world had become much smaller since Sarah died. The airport was his sanctuary now. Here Marcus knew exactly who he was and what he was supposed to do. He had been promoted to senior security officer 3 years ago, which meant he supervised the newer guards and handled special situations. His colleagues respected him for his reliability and attention to detail. Passengers might find him stern, but Marcus believed kindness had no place in security work. Rules existed for good reasons, and exceptions led to problems. Every morning Marcus arrived at work 30 minutes early. He reviewed the day's security briefings, checked his equipment, and walked his assigned sector. Terminal B was his territory, and he knew every corner, every shop, and every potential trouble spot. The grand piano in the departure lounge was one of those trouble spots. The piano had been installed 2 years ago as part of the airport's effort to create a more welcoming environment for travelers. The idea was that passengers could play music during their wait, turning the stressful experience of air travel into something more pleasant. Marcus had opposed the piano from the beginning. Musical instruments attracted crowds, and crowds created security concerns. But airport management had overruled his objections. Now Marcus spent part of each day dealing with piano-related incidents. Children banged on the keys without permission. Teenagers gathered around to record videos for social media. Adults played badly and annoyed other passengers. Every few weeks, Marcus had to ask someone to stop playing because they were creating a disturbance or violating the posted rules. The rules were clearly displayed on a sign next to the piano. Playing time was limited to 15 minutes per person. No amplified music or recording devices. Players must not obstruct passenger traffic. Most importantly, the piano was available only during designated hours to minimize noise complaints from nearby gate areas. Marcus had become the unofficial guardian of these rules. Other security officers joked that he could hear someone touching the piano keys from 50 yards away. They were not wrong. Marcus had developed an almost supernatural awareness of the instrument and the trouble it could cause. On this particular Tuesday afternoon, Marcus was completing his routine patrol when he spotted a woman approaching the piano. She was Asian, probably in her early 40s, with shoulder-length black hair and tired eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. She wore a simple grey sweater and dark jeans, carrying herself with the weary posture of someone who had been traveling too long. Rebecca Chen looked around the departure lounge and checked her phone. Her flight to Portland was now delayed by 4 hours due to mechanical problems. She had been sitting in uncomfortable chairs for most of the afternoon, trying to grade student papers on her laptop, but the noise and chaos of the airport made concentration impossible. The piano called to her like an old friend. Rebecca had not played piano in public for 15 years. Once music had been the center of her universe. She had studied at the San Francisco Conservatory of Music, performed in recitals and competitions, and dreamed of a career as a concert pianist. But life had taken her in a different direction. Now she was Dr. Rebecca Chen, a literature professor at Portland State University, and music existed only in the private corners of her heart. She approached the piano cautiously, reading the posted rules. It was past 6 o'clock, so the designated playing hours had ended. But the departure lounge was not particularly crowded, and Rebecca felt drawn to the instrument, despite the restrictions. She had been having a difficult semester at the university, dealing with budget cuts, increased class sizes, and administrative pressures that left little room for joy in her work. The delayed flight felt like a sign that she should take a moment for herself. Rebecca lifted the piano bench and sat down carefully. The keys were slightly dusty, and a few showed the wear marks of countless travelers who had played songs, scales, and random notes while waiting for their flights. She placed her hands above the keys but did not press them yet. Just sitting at a piano again felt like coming home. Marcus noticed the woman at the piano immediately. His trained eye took in her posture, her location, and the time displayed on his watch. 6:15 in the evening. The piano's designated hours had ended 15 minutes ago. Marcus began walking toward her, his hand already reaching for his radio to call for backup if needed. As he approached, Marcus prepared his standard speech about airport rules and regulations. He had delivered it hundreds of times to hundreds of different people. The rules were not suggestions, and Marcus's job was to enforce them consistently and fairly. Personal circumstances did not matter. Delayed flights did not create exceptions. The piano was closed for the evening, and that was final. But something made Marcus pause when he was still 20 feet away. The woman at the piano had not started playing yet. She was simply sitting there with her hands poised above the keys, her eyes closed, as if she were having a conversation with the instrument that no one else could hear. There was something in her stillness that reminded Marcus of Sarah in her final days, when she would sit quietly in her hospital bed, gathering strength for whatever came next. Marcus shook off the memory and continued his approach. Feelings had no place in security work. Rules were rules, regardless of how peaceful someone looked while breaking them. Rebecca opened her eyes as she heard footsteps approaching. She turned to see a tall, stern-looking security guard walking toward her with purpose. His gray hair was cut short in a military style, and his face showed the kind of weathered authority that came from years of dealing with difficult situations. Rebecca's heart sank. She had hoped for a few quiet minutes with the piano, but she recognized the look of someone who was about to deliver bad news. "Ma'am," Marcus said, his voice carrying the official tone he used for rule enforcement. "I'm going to have to ask you to step away from the piano." The designated playing hours ended at 6 o'clock. Rebecca looked at the security guard, and then at the nearly empty departure lounge around them. A few passengers sat scattered across the seating areas, most of them absorbed in their phones or sleeping. The nearest occupied gate was 30 yards away, and the ambient noise of the airport would easily mask any quiet piano music. "I understand," Rebecca said softly. "I was hoping to play just for a few minutes. My flight has been delayed for hours, and I thought—" She gestured helplessly at the piano. I promise I won't disturb anyone." Marcus had heard similar requests countless times before. Everyone had a story, everyone had a special circumstance that they believed justified an exception to the rules. Flight delays, family emergencies, personal celebrations, and heartbreak were all offered as reasons why the piano rules should be bent or ignored. Marcus had learned long ago that making exceptions led to chaos and complaints. "I'm sorry, ma'am," Marcus replied firmly. "The rules are posted clearly, and they apply to all passengers regardless of circumstances. The piano is closed for the evening." Rebecca felt a familiar disappointment settle over her. It was the same feeling she had experienced countless times over the past 15 years when music called to her, but life's practical demands pulled her away. She started to stand up from the piano bench, accepting defeat as she always did.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
But as Rebecca began to move away from the piano, something unexpected happened. Her hand brushed against the keys, and a single, clear note rang out across the departure lounge. It was just one note, probably A above middle C, but it hung in the air like a question waiting for an answer. Marcus heard the note and felt something shift inside his chest. It was not the chaotic banging of children or the fumbling attempts of amateur players. This single note had been struck with the kind of precision and intention that spoke of real musical training. Despite himself, Marcus found his stern expression softening slightly. Rebecca froze when she heard the note she had accidentally played. The sound was pure and resonant, exactly the kind of tone she remembered from the grand pianos at the conservatory. This airport piano was better than she had expected, probably well maintained despite the constant use by travelers. "I'm sorry," Rebecca said quickly, turning to face Marcus. "I didn't mean to play anything. It was an accident." Marcus looked at the woman more carefully now. Her apologetic manner and the way she had produced that perfect note suggested she was not another casual airport pianist. Her hands, he noticed, had the long, strong fingers of someone who had spent serious time at a keyboard. Her posture, even in her embarrassed state, showed the kind of discipline that came from formal training. "How long have you been playing?" Marcus asked, surprising himself with the question. It was not part of his usual rule enforcement routine. Rebecca hesitated. The question seemed genuine rather than official, and she saw something in the security guard's eyes that looked almost like curiosity. "Since I was 5, she answered. "But I haven't played in public for a very long time." Marcus found himself in unfamiliar territory. His job was to enforce rules, not to have conversations about people's musical backgrounds. But something about this woman's quiet dignity and obvious skill made him pause. Sarah had always said that Marcus was too rigid, too focused on rules, and not enough on people. Maybe, just this once, he could bend slightly without the world falling apart. The departure lounge remained quiet around them. The delayed flight meant that Rebecca would be waiting for hours anyway, and her soft playing was unlikely to disturb the few passengers in the area. Marcus looked around, confirming that no supervisors were nearby, and made a decision that surprised even him. 5 minutes, he said quietly. "Keep it soft, and if anyone complains or if my supervisor shows up, you stop immediately." Rebecca's eyes widened with surprise and gratitude. "Thank you," she said. "I'll be very quiet, I promise." Marcus nodded curtly and stepped back a few paces, but he did not walk away. Something made him want to hear what this woman would do with her 5 minutes of grace. He positioned himself where he could watch the departure lounge for any signs of trouble, while still being able to listen to whatever music might emerge from the piano. Rebecca settled back onto the piano bench and placed her hands on the keys. She had 5 minutes to reconnect with a part of herself that had been dormant for too long. Her mind quickly sorted through possible pieces to play. Nothing too complex or showy, nothing too loud or emotional. She needed something that would honor this unexpected gift of time and music without drawing unwanted attention. She decided on a piece by Eric Satie, Gymnopédie Noan. It was gentle and contemplative, the kind of music that could provide a moment of peace in a chaotic place like an airport. Rebecca had performed this piece many times during her conservatory years, and her fingers remembered every note and every subtle dynamic marking. As Rebecca began to play, the departure lounge seemed to transform around them. The harsh fluorescent lighting somehow felt softer. The constant background noise of announcements and rolling suitcases faded into insignificance. For the first time in years, Rebecca felt completely present in her own life, connected to something larger than her daily routine of lectures and grading and faculty meetings. Marcus had expected competent amateur playing, perhaps some classical piece played with reasonable skill. What he heard instead stopped him cold. The music that flowed from the piano was not just technically proficient, it was deeply expressive, each note carefully chosen and perfectly placed. This was not a professor amusing herself during a flight delay. This was an artist revealing her soul. The melody was simple but haunting, like a conversation between old friends who understood each other without words. Rebecca's hands moved across the keys with a confidence that spoke of years of serious study and practice. She played with her eyes closed, completely absorbed in the music, as if she had forgotten about the airport, the delayed flight, and even the security guard who had reluctantly given her permission to play. As the piece continued, Marcus found himself remembering things he had not thought about in years. He remembered Sarah singing while she cooked dinner, her voice floating through their small house like sunlight through windows. He remembered the way she would hum unconsciously when she was happy, creating melodies that existed nowhere else in the world. He remembered holding her hand during her final days, when music was one of the few things that could still bring her comfort. Other passengers began to notice the music too. A businessman who had been angrily typing emails on his phone looked up and paused his work. An elderly woman waiting near gate P12 closed her book and listened with a slight smile on her face. A young mother whose toddler had been fussing found that her child had grown quiet and calm, apparently soothed by the gentle melody. Rebecca played for exactly 5 minutes, ending the piece with the same delicate touch she had maintained throughout. When the last note faded into silence, she sat quietly for a moment, her hands still resting on the keys. The departure lounge seemed different now, as if something had shifted in the atmosphere that couldn't be easily explained. She looked up to find Marcus still standing nearby, but his stern expression had changed into something she couldn't quite identify. The businessman was applauding softly, and the elderly woman nodded her approval. Even the young mother mouthed "thank you" from across the seating area. "Time's up," Marcus said, but his voice lacked its earlier authority. If anything, he sounded reluctant to break the spell that the music had created. Rebecca nodded and began to close the piano bench. "Thank you for letting me play," she said simply. "I needed that more than I realized." As Rebecca gathered her belongings and prepared to return to her uncomfortable chair and delayed flight, Marcus found himself wanting to say something more. The woman's music had touched something in him that had been buried since Sarah's death, something he had thought was lost forever. But he was not sure how to express gratitude for a gift he had not known he needed. "What did you say your name was?" Marcus asked. "Rebecca," she replied. "Rebecca Chen." "I'm Marcus Williams," he said, extending his hand. "Senior Security Officer Williams, officially, but just Marcus is fine." They shook hands and Rebecca was surprised by the gentleness of Marcus's grip. Up close she could see that his stern face carried traces of sadness that reminded her of her own hidden struggles with disappointment and lost dreams. "That was beautiful," Marcus said quietly. "My wife would have loved it. She always said that music was the closest thing we have to magic." Rebecca heard the past tense in Marcus's words and understood immediately. "She had good taste," Rebecca said softly. "Music does have a way of connecting us to things that matter." Before either of them could say more, Marcus's radio crackled to life. "Unit 7, we have a situation at gate C15. Please respond." The spell was broken. Marcus straightened up, his official demeanor returning as duty called. "I have to go," he said. "Safe travels, Dr. Chen." As Marcus hurried away toward gate C15, Rebecca was left standing beside the silent piano, wondering how he had known she was a doctor. She had not mentioned her title during their brief conversation. Perhaps there was more to Senior Security Officer Williams than his stern exterior suggested. Rebecca returned to her seat and tried to focus on her work, but the music continued to echo in her mind. For 5 minutes she had been herself again, not the overworked professor dealing with budget cuts and administrative pressure, but the musician she had once dreamed of becoming. The feeling was both wonderful and painful, like rediscovering a room in your house that you had forgotten existed. Meanwhile, Marcus dealt with the minor emergency at gate C15, a passenger who had become agitated about another flight delay and needed to be calmed down. It was routine work that Marcus handled with his usual efficiency, but part of his mind remained back at the piano, replaying the unexpected beauty of Rebecca's performance. As his shift ended and Marcus prepared to go home to his empty apartment, he found himself thinking about Sarah and the conversations they used to have about music, dreams, and the small moments that make life meaningful. Tonight felt different somehow, as if a door had been opened that he had not even realized was closed. Rebecca's flight was finally called at 10:30 that evening. As she walked toward her gate, she passed the piano one more time.
It sat silent and waiting for tomorrow's travelers, but Rebecca could still hear the echo of her 5 minutes of freedom. She had no way of knowing that her brief performance had planted a seed in Marcus Williams' heart that would soon change both of their lives in ways neither of them could have imagined. The next morning, Marcus arrived at work 30 minutes early as always, but instead of heading directly to his usual patrol route, he found himself standing beside the piano in the departure lounge. In the harsh light of morning, it looked like an ordinary instrument again, showing the wear marks of countless amateur performances. But Marcus could still hear the haunting melody that Rebecca had played, and he could still remember the way her music had made him feel connected to something larger than his daily routine of rules and regulations. For the first time in 8 years, Marcus found himself thinking seriously about what his life had become, and what it might still become. The encounter with Rebecca Chen had reminded him that there was more to human experience than security protocols and shift schedules. There was beauty and grace and the possibility that even a 55-year-old airport security guard might still have room in his life for wonder. As passengers began to fill the departure lounge and another day of routine began, Marcus carried with him the memory of 5 minutes when rules had mattered less than humanity, when duty had stepped aside for grace, and when a stranger's gift of music had reminded him of truths that his wife Sarah had always known, that life was meant to be more than mere survival, and that sometimes the most important moments come disguised as ordinary encounters in the most unexpected places. The story that began with a delayed flight and a strict security guard was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. 3 weeks passed before Marcus saw Rebecca Chen again. During those weeks, something had shifted in his approach to his work at Denver International Airport. He still enforced the rules with his usual diligence, but he found himself paying closer attention to the people behind the violations. The businessman rushing to make a connection wasn't just someone breaking the no-running policy. He was a father trying to get home to his daughter's birthday party. The elderly woman struggling with the liquid restrictions wasn't just another inconvenience. She was carrying medicine for her ailing husband. Marcus had begun to notice the piano differently too. Instead of seeing it as a source of problems to manage, he observed the way it affected people. A tired businessman would sit down and play a few bars of a half-remembered song, his shoulders relaxing for the first time all day. Children would approach it with wonder, their fingers dancing across keys that produced magical sounds. Even the amateur players seemed to find something meaningful in their clumsy attempts at melody. The change was subtle enough that his colleagues hadn't noticed, but Marcus felt it every day. He still arrived 30 minutes early and followed his routines with military precision, but now he sometimes found himself humming Sarah's favorite songs while he walked his patrol route. The melodies came back to him gradually, like photographs developing in a dark room, revealing details he thought he had forgotten forever. On a Thursday afternoon in late October, Marcus was completing his rounds when he spotted a familiar figure in the departure lounge. Rebecca Chen sat in the same general area where he had first encountered her, but this time she was surrounded by stacks of papers and an open laptop. Her flight to Portland was displayed on the departure board with an ominous red delayed notation. Marcus approached slowly, unsure of the appropriate protocol for greeting someone who wasn't technically breaking any rules. Rebecca looked up from her laptop as his shadow fell across her workspace, and her face brightened with recognition. "Officer Williams," she said warmly. "I was hoping I might see you again." "Dr. Chen," Marcus replied, pleased that he had remembered her name correctly. Another delay. Rebecca gestured at the departure board with resigned humor. "Equipment problems again. They're saying at least 2 hours this time." She paused, studying his face. "You look different somehow, less intimidating," Marcus suggested with what might have been a smile. "I was going to say less burdened," Rebecca corrected gently. "Like something heavy has been lifted." Marcus was surprised by her perceptiveness. Over the past 3 weeks he had felt exactly as she described, as if a weight he hadn't realized he was carrying had been gradually removed. The change had started with her music that evening, though he couldn't have explained the connection to anyone else. "I've been thinking about what you played," Marcus admitted. "That night 3 weeks ago. I looked it up online, Satie's Gymnopédie. I'd never heard of it before, but I found myself listening to different recordings, trying to understand why it affected me so strongly." Rebecca's expression grew thoughtful. "And what did you discover?" Marcus was quiet for a moment, searching for words to describe something that felt more emotional than intellectual. "My wife used to say that some music doesn't just entertain you, it changes something inside you permanently. I never understood what she meant until I heard you play." The mention of his wife created a moment of shared silence between them. Rebecca sensed the grief that Marcus carried and recognized it as something familiar. She had her own losses, her own abandoned dreams that created similar shadows. "Would you like to sit down?" Rebecca asked, gesturing to an empty chair beside her workspace. "Unless you're on duty." Marcus glanced around the departure lounge, confirming that everything was peaceful and orderly. His supervisor was at the other end of the terminal, and the afternoon shift change wasn't for another hour. He sat down carefully, maintaining the posture of someone ready to spring into action if duty called. "Tell me about your wife," Rebecca said softly, "if you'd like to." Marcus hadn't talked about Sarah in any meaningful way since her funeral 8 years ago. His conversations with his daughter Emma were superficial by design, both of them avoiding the painful territory of memory and loss. His colleagues knew he was widowed, but they respected his privacy and never asked personal questions. Rebecca's gentle invitation felt like the first safe space he had encountered in years. "Sarah was a music teacher," Marcus began slowly. "Elementary school. She could make any child believe they were capable of creating something beautiful, even if they could barely carry a tune." His voice softened as the memories surfaced. "She used to say that everyone has music inside them, they just need help finding it." Rebecca nodded, understanding immediately. "She sounds like she understood the real purpose of music education. It's not about creating professional musicians, it's about giving people a language for emotions they can't express any other way." "Exactly," Marcus said, surprised by how perfectly Rebecca had captured Sarah's philosophy. "She would have loved hearing you play. She always said that real musicians don't perform for applause, they perform because the music demands to be heard." As they talked, Rebecca found herself sharing details about her own relationship with music that she rarely discussed with anyone. She told Marcus about her years at the San Francisco Conservatory, where she had been surrounded by other serious students who lived and breathed classical music. She described the intensity of that world, where talent was never enough and perfection was always just out of reach. "I was good," Rebecca said. "Very good, actually. But the classical music world is brutal in ways that people don't understand unless they've lived it. You can practice 8 hours a day for years and still not be good enough for the top tier of performers." Marcus listened intently as Rebecca explained how competitive pressures and financial realities had gradually worn down her confidence. Young pianists competed for a small number of prestigious positions, and even talented musicians often found themselves struggling to make a living in their chosen field. "So you became a professor instead?" Marcus asked. Rebecca's smile held traces of old disappointment. "I tell people I chose academic life because I wanted to share my love of literature with students. That's partly true, but the complete truth is that I wasn't brave enough to keep pursuing performance when the rejections started outnumbering the acceptances." "That doesn't sound like cowardice," Marcus observed. "It sounds like practical wisdom." "Maybe," Rebecca conceded, "but sometimes practical wisdom feels an awful lot like giving up." Their conversation was interrupted by an announcement over the airport's public address system. Rebecca's flight had been delayed another hour due to crew scheduling issues. She sighed and began organizing her papers, clearly frustrated by the ongoing delays. "At this rate, I'll be sleeping in the airport tonight," she said. "I have classes to teach tomorrow morning, and if this flight gets cancelled..." Marcus found himself making an impulsive offer. "The piano's available," he said. "If you want to play again. The evening hours don't start for another 2 hours, but I think we can make an exception for extenuating circumstances." Rebecca looked at him with surprise and gratitude. "Are you sure?"
"I don't want to get you in trouble. I've been thinking about those rules," Marcus replied. "They're important, but they're not sacred. Sometimes there are more important things than regulations." This statement represented such a dramatic shift in Marcus's worldview that Rebecca recognized its significance immediately. 3 weeks ago, he had been the embodiment of rigid rule enforcement. Now he was suggesting that circumstances might justify flexibility. Rebecca gathered her things and followed Marcus to the piano. As they walked across the departure lounge, she noticed how other passengers responded to Marcus's presence. His uniform still commanded respect, but his demeanor seemed more approachable than before. A young mother struggling with a cranky toddler smiled when Marcus nodded in her direction, and an elderly gentleman actually waved as they passed. At the piano, Marcus positioned himself where he could monitor the departure lounge while still being able to listen to Rebecca's performance. This time he was genuinely curious about what she would choose to play. Their conversation had revealed layers of complexity in her relationship with music that made him want to understand her story more completely. Rebecca sat at the piano and considered her options. 3 weeks ago, she had played safe, choosing a piece that was beautiful but uncontroversial. Today felt different. Her conversation with Marcus had touched on themes of loss, compromise, and the courage required to pursue dreams despite uncertainty. She decided to play something that reflected those realities. She chose Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, Op. 9, Op. 2. It was a piece she had performed many times during her conservatory years, one that showcased both technical skill and emotional depth. The Nocturne began with a simple lyrical melody that gradually developed into something more complex and expressive. As Rebecca played, Marcus found himself transported back to evenings in his small house with Sarah. She would grade papers at the kitchen table while he watched television, but when particularly beautiful music came on the radio, they would both stop what they were doing and listen together. Sarah had a way of moving her hands when she listened to piano music, as if she were playing along with the performer. The Chopin Nocturne was more elaborate than the Satie piece Rebecca had played during their first encounter, but it was equally moving. Her technique was flawless, but more importantly, her interpretation was deeply personal. She played as if the music were telling her own story of dreams deferred but not entirely abandoned. Other passengers began to gather at a respectful distance, drawn by the quality of the performance. Unlike 3 weeks ago, when only a few people had noticed her playing, this time Rebecca's music attracted a small but attentive audience. A businessman set down his phone and listened with complete focus. A teenage girl traveling with her family moved closer, obviously impressed by Rebecca's skill. Marcus watched the crowd's reaction with professional interest, but he also found himself studying Rebecca's face as she played. Her earlier sadness about abandoned dreams had been replaced by something that looked like joy mixed with longing. This was clearly where she belonged, at a piano creating beauty that touched everyone within earshot. When Rebecca finished the nocturne, the small audience applauded enthusiastically. The teenage girl approached the piano with obvious admiration. "That was incredible," the girl said. "Are you a professional pianist?" Rebecca smiled at the question, which hit closer to her unresolved feelings about her career than the girl could have known. "I'm a professor," she replied diplomatically. "But I used to study piano seriously." "You should be performing in concert halls," the girl insisted with the certainty of youth. "I take piano lessons, and I've never heard anyone play like that except on recordings." Marcus watched this exchange with growing understanding. Rebecca's talent was unmistakable, but something had prevented her from pursuing the career that her abilities seemed to demand. He wondered what had happened to derail her musical ambitions, and whether those obstacles were truly insurmountable or simply seemed that way from too close a perspective. As the crowd dispersed and Rebecca prepared to return to her delayed flight, Marcus made another impulsive decision. "Would you like to get coffee?" he asked. "There's a decent place in Terminal A, and you've got time before your flight." Rebecca accepted the invitation, curious about this security guard, who seemed to understand music and loss in ways that surprised her. They walked through the airport's corridors, past shops selling overpriced souvenirs and restaurants serving mediocre food to captive audiences of stranded travelers. The coffee shop Marcus chose was quieter than most airport establishments, with actual tables and chairs rather than just counter seating. They ordered their drinks and found a spot near a window that looked out over the runways, where planes took off and landed in the endless rhythm of modern travel. "Can I ask you something?" Marcus said as they settled into their chairs. "What made you stop performing? You're obviously talented enough to play professionally." Rebecca had been expecting this question since their first conversation, but she still wasn't sure how to answer it honestly, without sounding like she was making excuses for herself. The truth was complicated, involving both external obstacles and internal fears that had grown stronger over time. "It's a long story," she began, "and probably not as dramatic as you might expect." Marcus waited patiently, giving her space to find the right words. "I graduated from conservatory with high honors," Rebecca continued. "I won several competitions and had some promising auditions, but the music world is incredibly competitive, and success often depends as much on luck and connections as it does on talent." She paused to sip her coffee, gathering her thoughts. "I spent 2 years after graduation trying to establish myself as a performer. I auditioned for symphony orchestras, applied for artist residencies, competed for prizes that might have opened doors. I got close several times, but close doesn't pay the bills or build a career." Marcus nodded, recognizing the practical challenges that could derail even the most talented person's dreams. "Meanwhile, I was living in San Francisco with no steady income, working part-time jobs that barely covered my rent. My student loans were accumulating interest, and my parents were starting to worry that I was throwing my life away on an unrealistic dream." "What changed?" Marcus asked gently. Rebecca's expression grew thoughtful. "I got offered a teaching position at a small college in Oregon. It wasn't what I had envisioned for myself, but it was stable employment using my musical knowledge. I told myself it would be temporary, just a few years to get financially stable before returning to performance." "But temporary became permanent," Marcus observed. "Exactly. The teaching job led to graduate school in comparative literature, which led to my current position at Portland State. Each step made sense at the time, but when I look back I realize I was steadily moving away from the thing I loved most. Marcus understood this pattern from his own life. After Sarah's death, he had made a series of small decisions that seemed reasonable in isolation, but had collectively created a life that felt narrower and less meaningful than what he had shared with his wife. "Do you regret the path you chose?" he asked. Rebecca considered the question carefully. "I love my students and literature is genuinely fascinating to me. But I wonder sometimes what would have happened if I had been braver about pursuing music, even when the path was uncertain." "It's not too late," Marcus said, surprising himself with the boldness of the statement. "You're what, early 40s? Musicians can have long careers. Look at pianists like Martha Argerich or Mitsuko Uchida. They're still performing at the highest level in their 70s and 80s. Rebecca looked at Marcus with renewed interest. His knowledge of classical pianists was more extensive than she had expected from an airport security guard. "You really have been researching music since we last met," she observed. Marcus felt slightly embarrassed by his obvious enthusiasm. "Sarah always said I had the capacity to become passionate about things, but I needed the right catalyst. Apparently that catalyst was hearing you play." Their conversation was interrupted by an announcement that Rebecca's flight was finally boarding. As they gathered their things and prepared to leave the coffee shop, Marcus found himself reluctant to end their discussion. Rebecca represented a window into a world of beauty and meaning that he had forgotten existed. "Dr. Chen," he said, as they walked back toward her gate, "would it be appropriate for me to ask for your contact information? I'd like to continue our conversation sometime, if you're interested." Rebecca smiled and handed him her business card. "I'd like that too, Marcus, and please call me Rebecca." As Rebecca boarded her flight to Portland, she found herself thinking about Marcus Williams and the unexpected depth of their conversation. He was clearly a man who had built walls around his grief and was only beginning to realize that those walls might be unnecessary barriers to connection and growth. Marcus returned to his patrol duties with renewed focus, but his perspective had shifted again. The airport no longer felt like a collection of security challenges to be managed. Instead, it seemed like a crossroads where people's stories intersected briefly before continuing in directions that might lead anywhere. Over the following days, Marcus found himself researching classical music with the dedication he had once applied to security protocols. He listened to recordings of famous pianists, read about the history of the piano repertoire, and began to understand the world that Rebecca had inhabited during her conservatory years.
More importantly, he began to understand what Sarah had meant when she talked about music as a language of emotions. Each piece told a story, conveyed feelings that words couldn't capture, and connected performers and audiences in ways that transcended ordinary communication. A week after Rebecca's visit, Marcus did something that would have been unthinkable a month earlier. During his lunch break, he sat down at the departure lounge piano and attempted to play a simple melody that Sarah used to hum while cooking dinner. His technique was clumsy, and he could only manage a few bars before his fingers got confused. But the sound of those familiar notes filled him with a warmth he hadn't felt in years. An elderly woman sitting nearby smiled and nodded approvingly. "That's a lovely tune," she said. "Did you write it yourself?" Marcus shook his head. "My wife used to sing it. I'm not much of a musician, but I wanted to see if I could remember how it went." "Music is memory," the woman replied wisely. "Sometimes the heart remembers what the mind thinks it has forgotten." That evening, Marcus called his daughter Emma in Boston for the first time in 3 weeks. Instead of their usual brief exchange about work and weather, he found himself asking about her children's activities, her husband's job, and the small details of daily life that he had been avoiding since Sarah's death. "Dad, you sound different," Emma observed near the end of their conversation. "Happier, somehow." Marcus considered how to explain the changes he was experiencing without sounding foolish or overly dramatic. "I met someone who reminded me of some things your mother used to say about music and life. It's got me thinking differently about a lot of things."
That's wonderful, Dad. Mom always worried that you'd become too isolated after she was gone. She wanted you to stay open to new experiences and new people. After ending the call with Emma, Marcus sat in his small apartment and realized that Rebecca Chen had inadvertently become a catalyst for changes he hadn't known he needed. Her music had awakened something in him that had been dormant since Sarah's death, and their conversations had reminded him that life could still hold surprises and meaningful connections. He looked at Rebecca's business card, which he had propped against a framed photograph of Sarah on his kitchen table. Tomorrow, he decided, he would send her an email. He wasn't sure what he wanted to say, but he knew their story was far from finished. Meanwhile, in Portland, Rebecca had returned to her routine of teaching literature classes and grading papers, but she couldn't stop thinking about her conversations with Marcus. He had listened to her struggles with music and career choices without offering easy solutions or dismissive reassurances. Instead, he had asked thoughtful questions that helped her articulate feelings she had been avoiding for years. More importantly, Marcus had suggested that it might not be too late to reconsider the path she had chosen. The idea seemed both thrilling and terrifying, like standing at the edge of a cliff and contemplating flight. Rebecca found herself returning to the piano in her small apartment more frequently than she had in years. She worked through pieces she had performed during her conservatory days, rediscovering technical challenges and emotional depths she had nearly forgotten. Her fingers were stiff at first, but muscle memory proved more reliable than she had expected. As she played, Rebecca began to imagine possibilities that seemed impossible just a few weeks ago. Maybe Marcus was right. Maybe 42 wasn't too old to reconsider abandoned dreams. Maybe practical wisdom and artistic courage didn't have to be mutually exclusive. The seed of an idea began to form in Rebecca's mind, something that would require more bravery than she had shown in years, but might also lead to the kind of life integration she had been seeking without realizing it. When Marcus's email arrived the next day, suggesting they continue their conversation via phone or video call, Rebecca knew that their accidental meeting in the airport had started something that neither of them fully understood yet. She wrote back immediately, agreeing to a phone call that weekend and looking forward to exploring whatever this unexpected connection might become. Both Marcus and Rebecca were about to discover that some encounters change people in ways that ripple outward far beyond the original moment of contact, creating possibilities that wouldn't have existed if a flight had arrived on time and a security guard had been less willing to bend the rules for the sake of something beautiful. Part 3. The transformation. Their weekend phone conversations stretched for 3 hours, spanning topics from classical composers to career regrets to the small moments that define a meaningful life. Marcus found himself sharing stories about Sarah that he hadn't spoken aloud in years, while Rebecca described her current students and the satisfaction she found in introducing young minds to literature. By the time they hung up, both felt they had discovered an unexpected kindred spirit. Over the following months, their friendship deepened through regular phone calls and email exchanges. Marcus began attending classical music concerts in Denver, discovering a world of live performance that he had never explored during his marriage to Sarah. Rebecca started incorporating more music into her literature classes, drawing connections between poets and composers that illuminated both art forms for her students. The real turning point came in February when Rebecca called Marcus with news that would change everything. "I did something today that I haven't done in 15 years, she told him, her voice trembling with excitement and fear. Marcus was walking his evening patrol route, but he stepped into a quiet alcove to give Rebecca his full attention. "What did you do?" "I submitted an application to perform in the Portland Chamber Music Festival. It's a small event, but it features both established and emerging artists. They have a category for musicians returning to performance after extended breaks." Marcus felt his heart accelerate on Rebecca's behalf. He had been encouraging her to consider returning to performance for months, but he knew the courage required to actually take that step was enormous. "That's incredible, Rebecca. How do you feel?" "Terrified," she admitted. It's been so long since I performed for judges or competed with other musicians. What if I've lost whatever spark I used to have? What if 15 years of academic life has made me too comfortable with safety to take artistic risks? Marcus understood her fears intimately. Since Sarah's death, he had built his entire life around predictability and control, avoiding situations that might expose him to disappointment or loss. Rebecca's willingness to embrace uncertainty inspired him and made him question his own cautious approach to living. "You haven't lost anything," he told her firmly. "Every time I've heard you play, even in an airport departure lounge, you've created something beautiful and meaningful. The spark is still there. It's just been waiting for the right opportunity to shine again." Their conversation was interrupted by commotion near gate B18. Marcus could see passengers gathering around someone on the floor, and his security training kicked in immediately. "Rebecca, I need to handle an emergency here. Can I call you back later?" "Of course. Go do what you do." Marcus hurried toward the disturbance and found an elderly gentleman who had collapsed while walking to his gate. The man was conscious but disoriented, and his wife was kneeling beside him in obvious distress. Marcus quickly called for medical assistance while helping to clear space around the couple and keep curious onlookers at a respectful distance. As paramedics arrived and began assessing the situation, Marcus noticed that the man's wife was shaking with anxiety. She was in her 70s, dressed in clothing that suggested modest means, and clearly overwhelmed by the medical emergency and airport chaos. "Man," Marcus said gently, crouching beside her, "the paramedics are taking good care of your husband. Is there anything I can do to help you?" The woman looked up at Marcus with grateful eyes. "We were supposed to fly to Phoenix to see our granddaughter's wedding. Harold saved for 2 years to afford these tickets. He's going to be so upset if we miss it." Marcus felt his heart constrict with empathy. 6 months ago he would have offered practical assistance while maintaining professional distance. Now, influenced by his friendship with Rebecca and his growing awareness of the human stories behind every security incident, he saw this couple as individuals facing a crisis that threatened something precious to them. "Let's focus on making sure Harold is okay first," Marcus said. "Then we'll figure out the rest." The paramedics determined that Harold had experienced a minor episode related to his blood pressure medication, but they wanted to transport him to the hospital for observation. His wife Martha would need to accompany him, which meant missing their flight and losing the money they had spent on non-refundable tickets. Marcus watched Martha's face crumble as she realized the implications. This wasn't just about missing a wedding, it was about the sacrifice of resources they couldn't afford to lose, and the disappointment of dreams that might not get a second chance at their age. Without thinking about protocols or regulations, Marcus made a decision that would have been impossible for him before meeting Rebecca. He approached the gate agent and explained Harold and Martha's situation, advocating for them to be rebooked on a later flight without penalty despite the airline's normal policies. "I understand the rules," Marcus told the initially reluctant agent, "but sometimes circumstances require flexibility. This couple has been planning this trip for years, and a medical emergency shouldn't destroy their chance to celebrate with their family." The gate agent, perhaps influenced by Marcus's security credentials and obvious sincerity, agreed to make an exception. Harold and Martha would be able to use their tickets on a flight the following day once Harold was cleared by doctors. When Marcus returned to share this news with Martha, she burst into tears of gratitude. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "You don't even know us. That's exactly why I had to do it." Marcus replied, understanding the truth of his words as he spoke them. "We're all just people trying to get through life with dignity and hope. Sometimes we need someone to bend the rules on our behalf." Later that evening, Marcus called Rebecca back to finish their conversation about the music festival application. But first he told her about Harold and Martha and the way their situation had affected him. 6 months ago I would have followed procedure and let them deal with their crisis alone," he admitted. "But knowing you has changed how I see people and situations.
You've helped me remember that rules exist to serve humanity, not the other way around. Rebecca was quiet for a moment, processing the implications of Marcus's story. It sounds like we've been changing each other, she said finally. You've given me courage to pursue music again, and I've apparently helped you rediscover compassion. Maybe that's what friendship is supposed to do, Marcus suggested.
Help us become better versions of ourselves. 2 weeks later, Rebecca called with the news Marcus had been hoping to hear. She had been accepted to perform at the Portland Chamber Music Festival. Her audition recording had impressed the selection committee, and she would be performing a solo recital as part of the festival's Emerging Artist series. I can't believe it, Rebecca said, her voice mixing joy with disbelief. They want me to perform 3 pieces, including 1 contemporary work and 1 piece of my own choosing. It's been so long since I had to prepare for a real performance. Marcus could hear both excitement and terror in her voice. This opportunity represented everything Rebecca had thought she had given up 15 years ago, but it also required her to risk public failure after years of safe academic life. What pieces are you thinking of performing? Marcus asked. I'm definitely including the Chopin Nocturne I played for you at the airport. It feels like the piece that started this whole journey back to music. For the contemporary work, I'm considering a piece by Caroline Shaw that explores themes of memory and transformation. As Rebecca described her preparation process, Marcus found himself wanting to be more than just a supportive voice on the phone. An idea began forming in his mind, something that would have been unthinkable before their friendship but now felt like a natural expression of everything he had learned about taking meaningful risks. Rebecca, he said, interrupting her detailed discussion of practice schedules, would it be appropriate for me to attend your performance? I know we've never met in person outside the airport, but this feels like something I should witness. Rebecca's silence stretched long enough that Marcus wondered if he had overstepped some boundary he didn't understand. Finally, she spoke, and her voice was thick with emotion. Marcus, I would love for you to be there. In fact, I can't imagine performing without knowing you're in the audience. You're the person who helped me remember why music matters. Marcus began making plans for his first vacation in 5 years. He requested time off work, booked a flight to Portland, and reserved a hotel room near the concert venue. The anticipation of hearing Rebecca perform in a formal setting filled him with an excitement he hadn't felt since the early days of his marriage to Sarah. But Marcus's transformation went beyond supporting Rebecca's return to music. At work, his colleagues noticed that he approached his duties with a combination of authority and kindness that made him more effective than ever. Passengers who might once have felt intimidated by his stern demeanor now sought him out for help and guidance. Marcus began volunteering to work special events at the airport, situations that required both security expertise and interpersonal skills. When the airport hosted a holiday concert series featuring local musicians, Marcus made sure the piano in the departure lounge was properly maintained and available for anyone who wanted to play. One afternoon, a young soldier returning from overseas sat down at the piano and began playing a haunting melody that drew passengers from throughout Terminal B. Instead of worrying about crowd control, Marcus helped maintain respectful space around the pianist while allowing people to gather and listen. The impromptu concert became a moment of shared humanity in a place usually characterized by stress and hurry. Emma noticed the changes in her father during their weekly phone calls. Their conversations became longer and more substantive, covering topics beyond weather and work. Marcus began asking about his grandchildren's interests and activities, and he started planning a visit to Boston for the first time since Sarah's funeral. "Dad, I don't know what's happened to you over the past few months," Emma told him during one call, "but you sound like the person you were before Mom got sick. It's wonderful to have you back." Marcus realized that his friendship with Rebecca had indeed brought him back to himself, but to a self that was wiser and more compassionate than the man he had been even during his marriage to Sarah.
Grief and rigid routine had protected him from further loss, but they had also isolated him from the possibilities of growth and connection. As Rebecca's performance date approached, Marcus found himself researching not just her specific pieces, but the broader context of classical music performance. He learned about the history of the Portland Chamber Music Festival, the acoustics of the venue where she would perform, and the careers of other musicians who had used similar opportunities to relaunch their performing lives. The week before his trip to Portland, something unexpected happened at Denver International Airport. Marcus was completing his evening patrol when he heard familiar music coming from the departure lounge piano. Someone was playing Satie's Jimapedi No. 1, the same piece Rebecca had performed during their first encounter. Marcus approached the piano to find a teenage girl playing with remarkable skill and sensitivity. Her technique was still developing, but her musical understanding was sophisticated far beyond her years. A few passengers had gathered to listen, including the girl's parents who watched with obvious pride and amazement. When the girl finished playing, Marcus approached her family. "Your daughter is very talented," he told the parents. "Has she been studying long?" The girl's mother smiled. "Jessica has been taking lessons for 6 years, but we've never heard her play anything this beautiful. She said she learned it from a video she found online of someone playing in an airport." Marcus felt his heart skip. A video of someone playing in an airport. "Yes," Jessica chimed in. "It was this amazing woman who played at an airport, and everyone was so moved by her music. The video went viral, and I've been practicing the piece ever since. It's the most beautiful song I've ever heard." Marcus realized that Rebecca's performance 3 weeks ago had been recorded by someone in the departure lounge and shared online, touching lives in ways neither of them had imagined. The music she had created in a moment of personal expression had rippled outward to inspire young musicians like Jessica. "Would you like to learn more pieces like that one?" Marcus asked Jessica. "More than anything," she replied immediately. Marcus spent the next few minutes talking with Jessica and her parents about music education resources in their home city of Seattle. He found himself sharing information he had learned from Rebecca about the importance of finding teachers who understood both technique and artistic expression. As Jessica's family prepared to board their flight, the girl approached Marcus one more time. "Thank you for letting me play," she said. "My parents were worried I might get in trouble, but you made them feel like it was okay." "Music should never get anyone in trouble," Marcus replied. "It's one of the best things people can share with each other." That night, Marcus called Rebecca to tell her about Jessica and the discovery that her airport performance had been viewed by thousands of people online. "I had no idea anyone was recording," Rebecca said, sounding both embarrassed and pleased. "I was so focused on the music that I forgot about everything else." "That's exactly why it was so powerful," Marcus told her. "You weren't performing for an audience. You were just being yourself, sharing something beautiful, because it needed to be shared. Like you sharing kindness with passengers, even when it's not required by your job description." Rebecca observed, "We've both learned something about authenticity, haven't we?" The day of Rebecca's performance, Marcus flew to Portland with a mixture of excitement and nervousness that reminded him of attending Sarah's school concerts decades earlier. He had never been to a classical music festival, and he wasn't sure about proper etiquette or expectations. The venue was an intimate hall that seated about 200 people, with excellent acoustics and an atmosphere that felt both formal and welcoming. Marcus arrived early and found his seat in the 4th row, close enough to see Rebecca's expressions, but far enough back to give her space for concentration. As audience members filled the hall, Marcus observed the diverse group that chamber music attracted. There were elderly patrons who had probably been attending classical concerts for decades, young students with scores in their laps, and middle-aged professionals seeking cultural enrichment after work. Everyone seemed united by anticipation and respect for the art form they had come to experience. When Rebecca walked onto the stage, Marcus felt his breath catch. She wore an elegant black dress and carried herself with a poise he had only glimpsed during their airport encounters. At the piano, she took a moment to settle herself before beginning her first piece, the contemporary work by Caroline Shaw. The music that emerged was unlike anything Marcus had heard before, combining traditional classical techniques with modern harmonic language and rhythmic complexity. Rebecca's performance was confident and expressive, demonstrating that her years away from formal performance had not diminished her ability to interpret challenging music. But it was her performance of the Chopin Nocturne that truly transported Marcus. This was the piece she had played for him in the airport departure lounge, but in this formal setting, with proper acoustics and an attentive audience, its beauty expanded to fill every corner of the hall. Rebecca played with a depth of emotion that spoke to universal themes of loss, hope, and the resilience of the human spirit. As the final notes of the nocturne faded into silence, the audience erupted in enthusiastic applause. Marcus found himself with tears in his eyes, overwhelmed by pride in Rebecca's achievement and gratitude for the journey that had brought them both to this moment. After the concert, Marcus waited in the lobby while Rebecca greeted well-wishers and spoke with other festival participants. When she finally spotted him in the crowd, her face lit up with a joy that made his long trip worthwhile. "You came," she said, embracing him warmly. "I can't believe you actually came. I wouldn't have missed it," Marcus replied. "Rebecca, that was extraordinary. You belong on that stage." As they walked to a nearby restaurant for a late dinner, Rebecca shared her post-performance reflections. The experience had reminded her why she had fallen in love with music in the first place, but it had also shown her that she had grown as an artist during her years in academia. "I used to think that leaving performance meant giving up my identity as a musician," she told Marcus over dessert. "But tonight I realized that all those years of teaching and studying literature have given me new ways to understand and interpret music. I'm a different performer now than I was at 25, but maybe I'm a better one." Marcus understood exactly what she meant. His own transformation over the past months had taught him that growth often requires letting go of old versions of ourselves to make room for new possibilities. "What happens next?" he asked. Rebecca smiled, and Marcus could see the excitement and determination in her eyes. "I've been invited to perform at 2 more festivals this year, and my department chair at Portland State has agreed to let me incorporate more music into my literature courses. I think I've found a way to be both an academic and a performer without having to choose just one identity."
As Marcus prepared to return to Denver the next day, he reflected on the changes that had occurred in both their lives since that first encounter at the airport piano. Rebecca had rediscovered her musical voice and found the courage to share it with the world again. He had learned to balance professional responsibility with human compassion, and he had opened his heart to friendship and growth after years of protective isolation. Their story had begun with a delayed flight and a strict interpretation of airport rules, but it had evolved into something neither of them could have predicted. 2 people from different worlds had found common ground in music, understanding, and the willingness to support each other's dreams. 6 months later, Marcus received an invitation that filled him with pride and amazement. Rebecca was performing as a featured artist at a music festival in Denver, and she wanted him to be her guest of honor. The girl who had once played piano in secret in an airport departure lounge was now confident enough to return to the place where her musical resurrection had begun. On the night of Rebecca's Denver performance, Marcus sat in the front row of a concert hall filled with people who had come to hear her play. As she began her program with Satie's Gymnopédie Nomowwood, Marcus thought about all the lives that had been touched by their friendship and her music. Jessica, the teenage pianist in Seattle, Harold and Martha, who had finally made it to their granddaughter's wedding. His own daughter Emma, who had noticed her father's return to full engagement with life. When Rebecca finished her performance to a standing ovation, she looked directly at Marcus and smiled. In that moment, he understood that their chance meeting had created ripples that would continue to spread far beyond anything they could imagine. Some encounters change people in ways that transform not just the individuals involved, but everyone they touch thereafter. Marcus and Rebecca had found each other at Denver International Airport, but they had discovered something much more valuable than friendship. They had rediscovered the possibility of growth, courage, and authentic connection at any stage of life. As Marcus applauded Rebecca's triumph, he knew that their story was far from over. It was instead a new beginning for two people who had learned that it's never too late to rediscover who you're meant to be. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of the Rebecca Chen Music Academy as Dr. Rebecca Chen unlocked the front door and stepped inside. The converted warehouse in Portland's Pearl District had been transformed into something she had never imagined possible 5 years ago, a music school that bridged the gap between academic excellence and artistic passion, serving students from all economic backgrounds. Rebecca paused in the main performance hall, where 25 donated pianos of various sizes and qualities were arranged in careful rows. The space would come alive in an hour, when her students arrived for Saturday morning classes, but for now it belonged to the quiet anticipation that preceded music making. She walked to the Steinway grand piano at the front of the room, an instrument that had been donated by a wealthy patron who had heard Rebecca perform at the Oregon Symphony's annual gala. Running her fingers along the polished wood, Rebecca reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The success of her return to performing had exceeded every expectation. After that first chamber music festival, invitations had multiplied steadily. She now performed 20 to 30 concerts per year, balancing solo recitals with chamber music collaborations and occasional concerto appearances with regional orchestras. More importantly, she had found a way to integrate her love of teaching with her renewed passion for performance. The Rebecca Chen Music Academy had opened 3 years ago with 15 students and a single rented classroom. Now it served over 200 students ranging in age from 5 to 75, with a sliding scale tuition structure that made quality music education accessible to families across the economic spectrum. Rebecca still maintained her position at Portland State University, but she had negotiated a reduced teaching load that allowed her to focus on both performing and running the academy. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Marcus Williams in Denver. "Flight lands at 2:30. Looking forward to tonight's concert and seeing the academy. Emma and the kids can't wait to meet you." Rebecca smiled as she typed back, "I'll pick you up at the airport. Fair warning, Emma might interrogate you about your intentions toward her father's happiness." Their friendship had deepened over the 5 years since that first encounter at Denver International Airport. Marcus visited Portland every few months, timing his trips to coincide with Rebecca's local performances when possible. Rebecca had spent several holidays in Denver, getting to know Emma's family and witnessing Marcus's transformation into an engaged grandfather who actually enjoyed family gatherings. The changes in Marcus had been remarkable to observe. His colleagues at Denver International Airport still respected his authority and professionalism, but passengers now approached him with problems and questions instead of avoiding his intimidating presence. He had been promoted to security training supervisor, a position that allowed him to share his philosophy of balancing rule enforcement with human compassion. More significantly, Marcus had begun taking piano lessons. At 59 years old, he was hardly a prodigy, but his steady progress and obvious enjoyment reminded Rebecca daily that music belonged to everyone, not just those with exceptional talent or early training. When Marcus played simple pieces during his visits to Portland, his careful attention to every note and phrase moved Rebecca more than technically perfect performances by conservatory students. The academy's front door chimed as Rebecca's assistant, David Park, arrived with coffee and the morning's schedule. David was a recent graduate of Portland State's music program who had chosen to work at the academy instead of pursuing traditional performance opportunities. He represented a new generation of musicians who valued community engagement as much as artistic achievement. "The Portland Tribune photographer will be here at 10, David reminded Rebecca as he handed her a cup of coffee. "They want to get shots of the scholarship students for the Sunday feature article." Rebecca nodded, still amazed that the Academy's work had attracted enough attention to merit newspaper coverage. The article would focus on the Academy's innovative program that paired adult students returning to music with younger scholarship recipients, creating mentor relationships that benefited both groups. The program had been Marcus's idea during one of his visits. He had observed how older students brought life experience and patience to their practice, while younger students possessed technical adaptability and fearless creativity. Pairing them as practice partners and recital collaborators had created some of the Academy's most meaningful musical relationships. As students began arriving for morning classes, Rebecca watched the familiar transformation of empty practice rooms into spaces filled with scales, etudes, and emerging artistry. Mrs. Rodriguez, a 60-year-old housekeeper, worked patiently through a Bach invention, while her practice partner, 12-year-old Michael Kim, offered gentle suggestions about phrasing and dynamics. Their unlikely friendship had developed over 2 years of shared lessons and had enriched both of their musical journeys. In another room, 17-year-old Jessica Martinez practiced for her upcoming audition at the San Francisco Conservatory. Jessica's family had immigrated from El Salvador when she was 10, bringing nothing but hope and determination. Her exceptional musical talent had emerged during middle school, but private lessons had been financially impossible until she received a full scholarship to the Academy. Rebecca remembered her first lesson with Jessica, who had arrived with calloused hands from helping her father's landscaping business, and an ear for music that was nothing short of extraordinary. Now Jessica was preparing for conservatory auditions with the same focused intensity Rebecca remembered from her own student days, but with an additional layer of maturity that came from understanding the value of opportunities. "Dr. Chen," Jessica called out as Rebecca passed her practice room, "could you listen to the Chopin ballad? I think I figured out the transition in the development section, but I want to make sure it sounds natural." Rebecca entered the practice room and listened as Jessica played through the challenging passage. The technical execution was flawless, but more importantly, Jessica's musical interpretation showed the kind of personal expression that couldn't be taught through instruction alone. "That's beautiful, Jessica. You've found the emotional core of that transition. Remember that feeling when you perform it at your auditions." As Jessica returned to her practice, Rebecca felt the satisfaction that had become familiar over the past 3 years. Teaching at the Academy was different from her university work, more immediate and personal. These students weren't fulfilling degree requirements, they were pursuing music because it called to something essential in their lives. The morning progressed with the comfortable chaos of a busy music school. Older students arrived for adult group classes while younger scholarship recipients prepared for individual lessons. The intergenerational mixing that Marcus had encouraged created an atmosphere unlike traditional music schools, where students were typically segregated by age and skill level. Rebecca paused outside the main performance hall as 10-year-old Sarah Williams, Marcus's granddaughter, worked through a simplified arrangement of the Satie piece that had started Rebecca's return to performance. Sarah was visiting Portland for the week with her mother Emma, and Rebecca had been giving her informal lessons at the Academy. Sarah played with the unself-conscious joy that Rebecca remembered from her own childhood, before competition and comparison had complicated her relationship with music. Watching Sarah's natural musical expression, Rebecca understood why Marcus spoke so proudly of his grandchildren and their various talents and interests. "She has good instincts," observed Mrs. Chen, an elderly woman who had enrolled in beginner piano classes 6 months earlier, despite having no previous musical experience. Mrs. Chen, who shared Rebecca's surname but no family relationship, had become one of the Academy's most dedicated adult students. "Music doesn't belong to the young," Mrs. Chen continued, settling onto the bench beside Sarah, "but the young remind us why we fell in love with it in the first place." This intergenerational perspective had become one of the Academy's defining characteristics. Adult students brought patience, life experience and appreciation for the privilege of learning music. Younger students contributed energy,
fearlessness, and the kind of rapid progress that inspired their older practice partners to persist through technical challenges. The Portland Tribune photographer arrived as scheduled, documenting the Academy's unique approach to music education. Rebecca found herself explaining the philosophy behind the mentor program, the sliding scale tuition structure, and the Academy's commitment to making quality music instruction accessible regardless of economic circumstances. "What inspired you to create this model?" the journalist asked as they watched Mrs. Rodriguez and Michael Kim perform a duet they had arranged together. Rebecca thought about the question, tracing the Academy's origins back through her own journey of rediscovering performance, her friendship with Marcus, and the lessons she had learned about the barriers that prevent people from pursuing their musical interests. "I learned that talent exists everywhere, but opportunity doesn't," Rebecca replied. Traditional music education often assumes that students have financial resources, family support, and time to devote exclusively to practice. We wanted to create a space where musical learning could accommodate real life instead of requiring people to choose between music and other responsibilities. The journalist nodded, scribbling notes as she observed the diverse group of students preparing for the afternoon masterclass. The masterclass had become a monthly tradition at the Academy, featuring visiting artists who worked with students of all levels in a supportive educational environment. Today's guest artist was Maria Gonzalez, a violinist with the Oregon Symphony, who had grown up in circumstances similar to many of the Academy's scholarship students. Maria's presence demonstrated to younger students that professional musical careers were achievable regardless of background, while her teaching approach emphasized musical expression over technical perfection. As the masterclass began, Rebecca stepped outside to call Marcus and confirm his flight information. The October afternoon was crisp and bright, with the kind of clear skies that made Portland's natural beauty particularly striking. Mount Hood was visible in the distance, snow-capped and majestic against the blue sky. "We just landed," Marcus reported when he answered his phone. "Emma's already asking when we're going to hear you perform tonight. Tell her it's just a small faculty recital at Portland State. Nothing too fancy." "Rebecca, you know better than that. Every time you perform is special."
Their conversation was interrupted by Sarah's voice in the background, asking if she could practice piano at Rebecca's house that evening. The enthusiasm in the 10-year-old's voice reminded Rebecca of her own childhood excitement about music before professional pressure had complicated her relationship with performance. "Of course she can practice," Rebecca told Marcus. "I have a nice upright piano at home that would be perfect for her." As Rebecca returned to the Academy, she reflected on how her life had evolved since that delayed flight at Denver International Airport 5 years ago. She was performing more regularly and meaningfully than she ever had during her 20s, but the Academy had become equally important to her sense of purpose and fulfillment. The masterclass was proceeding beautifully, with Maria Gonzalez working individually with students while their practice partners and family members watched from comfortable chairs arranged around the performance space. Mrs. Rodriguez was receiving feedback on her interpretation of a Mozart sonata movement, her concentration absolute as she incorporated Maria's suggestions about phrasing and dynamics. "Music is a language," Maria explained to the gathered students. "But like any language, it becomes more expressive when you have something personal to communicate. Mrs. Rodriguez brings life experience to Mozart that a younger player might not possess. That's not better or worse than youthful interpretation, just different and equally valuable." This philosophy had become central to the Academy's approach. Rather than treating adult beginners as inferior to child prodigies, the Academy celebrated the unique perspectives that students of all ages brought to their musical learning. The result was a community where musical growth was valued over musical competition. Jessica Martinez performed next, playing the Chopin ballad she had been practicing earlier. Her performance was technically accomplished and emotionally mature, drawing appreciative murmurs from the audience of fellow students and family members. "You play with the heart of someone who understands that music is a privilege, not a right," Maria told Jessica after she finished. "That understanding will serve you well in conservatory and beyond." As the masterclass concluded, Rebecca began preparing for the evening's faculty recital at Portland State. She would be performing chamber music with colleagues from the university, including pieces by contemporary composers that challenged both performers and audiences to expand their musical horizons. The drive to the university took Rebecca through neighborhoods where many of her academy students lived, past the community centers and libraries where she sometimes gave outreach performances. These informal concerts had become an important part of her performing life, equally satisfying as formal recitals in prestigious venues. At Portland State, Rebecca met with her chamber music colleagues for a final rehearsal before the evening performance. The program included works by living composers alongside classical masterpieces, reflecting the Academy's philosophy of honoring musical tradition while embracing contemporary innovation. "I heard you're starting a new program at the Academy," mentioned Dr. Sarah Kim, the violinist who would be performing with Rebecca that evening. "Something about pairing music students with literature students." Rebecca nodded enthusiastically. "We're launching it next semester. Students from both programs will collaborate on projects that explore connections between poetry and music, literary themes in classical compositions, that sort of thing. I think it will enrich both disciplines." This interdisciplinary approach had emerged from Rebecca's own dual identity as literature professor and performing musician. Rather than viewing her academic and artistic pursuits as separate, she had found ways to make them mutually reinforcing. The faculty recital that evening drew a respectable audience of students, colleagues, and community members. Rebecca performed a sonata by contemporary composer Caroline Shaw that required both technical precision and interpretive creativity. The piece challenged listeners with its unconventional harmonic language while remaining emotionally accessible. Marcus, Emma, and Sarah sat in the third row, Emma beaming with pride as she watched her father's friend perform. Marcus listened with the focused attention Rebecca had come to associate with his approach to everything he cared about, whether enforcing airport security or learning piano scales. After the concert, they gathered at Rebecca's house for a quiet dinner and conversation. Emma had inherited her father's directness but applied it to more personal subjects than airport regulations. "So when are you two going to stop pretending this is just friendship?" Emma asked over dessert, causing both Rebecca and Marcus to look at her with surprise. "Emma," Marcus said with parental warning in his voice. "Dad, you've been traveling to Portland every 2 months for 3 years. Rebecca calls you every Sunday. You light up whenever anyone mentions her name." "I'm not blind." Rebecca and Marcus exchanged glances, both recognizing the truth in Emma's observation. Their relationship had evolved beyond friendship over the past year, but neither had wanted to risk changing something that was already meaningful and satisfying. "Your father and I care deeply about each other," Rebecca said carefully, "but we're both set in our ways, living in different cities with complicated lives and responsibilities. That's exactly why you should stop wasting time," Sarah piped up from the piano bench where she was playing scales. "Grandpa taught me that life is short and you shouldn't postpone happiness." Marcus looked at his granddaughter with amazement. "When did I teach you that?" "When you told me about Grandma Sarah and how you wished you had appreciated every day with her instead of worrying so much about the future." The conversation continued late into the evening, with Emma and Sarah eventually retreating to the guest room while Marcus and Rebecca sat on the back porch discussing the changes in their lives since that first airport encounter. "Emma's not wrong," Marcus said finally. "We have been dancing around something that feels important to both of us." Rebecca took his hand, noting how much gentler it had become since he started playing piano. "I've been thinking about that too, but I'm scared of changing something that's already wonderful. What if we changed it into something even more wonderful?" They sat in comfortable silence, watching the lights of Portland spread out below Rebecca's hillside neighborhood. Both understood that their relationship had reached a crossroads that required either deeper commitment or honest acknowledgement that friendship was sufficient. "I've been offered a position in Denver," Rebecca said quietly. "The University of Colorado wants me to start a program similar to the Academy but integrated with their music school. I haven't said yes because it would mean leaving everything I've built here. Marcus felt his heart skip. When would this start? Next fall if I accept. It would mean relocating the academy concept, but with university resources and support, I could continue performing while developing something even larger than what we have in Portland. The possibility hung between them like a bridge they could choose to cross or leave unexplored. Marcus understood that Rebecca's decision about the Denver position would determine not just her career trajectory, but the future of their relationship. "What does your heart tell you to do?" he asked. Rebecca smiled at the question, recognizing it as something she might have asked a student facing a difficult choice about musical interpretation or career direction. "My heart tells me that the most beautiful music happens when talented people support each other's growth instead of competing for limited opportunities. It tells me that home isn't necessarily a place but a combination of purpose and people that make you feel fully yourself." Marcus understood her meaning immediately. "Denver would be lucky to have you, and I would be honored to help you build something new there." The next morning, as Marcus and his family prepared to return to Denver, Rebecca made a decision that surprised even herself. She asked to accompany them to the airport, not just to say goodbye but to begin serious conversations with the University of Colorado about their offer. At Denver International Airport, they stood beside the same piano where Rebecca and Marcus had first encountered each other 5 years earlier. Sarah immediately sat down and began playing the Satie piece she had been learning, drawing smiles from passing travelers who stopped to listen. "Some circles are meant to be completed," Marcus observed as he watched his granddaughter perform at the piano where Rebecca had rediscovered her musical voice. Rebecca nodded, understanding that their story was approaching not an ending but a transformation. The academy in Portland would continue under David Park's capable leadership, while she began planning something new in Denver that could serve an even larger community of aspiring musicians. 6 months later, Rebecca stood in the main hall of the University of Colorado Music Building, watching workers install donated pianos for the Rebecca Chen Community Music Academy. The university-based program would serve students from throughout the Denver metropolitan area, with satellite locations planned for airports, libraries, and community centers. Marcus had taken early retirement from airport security to become the academy's community outreach coordinator, a position that utilized his understanding of diverse populations and his growing knowledge of music education. Their relationship had evolved naturally into partnership, both personal and professional, based on shared values and complementary strengths. The Denver Academy's opening concert featured performances by students ranging in age from 7 to 77, including several airport employees who had been inspired by Marcus's example to begin musical studies. The program concluded with Rebecca and Marcus performing a simple duet arrangement of the Satie piece that had started their journey together. As they played, Rebecca reflected on the unpredictable path that had led from a delayed flight and a strict security guard to this moment of musical community and personal fulfillment. She had learned that the most meaningful performances weren't necessarily in the world's great concert halls but wherever music could touch lives and create connections between people. Marcus, concentrating carefully on his part of the duet, marveled at how much his life had expanded since he had first heard Rebecca play in the airport departure lounge. He had discovered that enforcing rules was less satisfying than helping people find ways to achieve their dreams within reasonable boundaries. In the audience, Emma Williams Chen, now using her hyphenated married name to honor both her birth family and her chosen musical family, applauded along with her children and the diverse crowd of Academy supporters. She had moved to Denver 6 months earlier to be closer to her father and to help manage the Academy's administrative operations. The evening concluded with Sarah, now 11 and an intermediate piano student, performing a piece she had composed herself. The music was simple but heartfelt, incorporating elements of the Satie piece that had brought her grandfather and step-grandmother together, while adding her own youthful perspective on themes of friendship, growth, and possibility.
As the audience applauded Sarah's composition, Rebecca and Marcus exchanged glances that contained 5 years of shared growth, mutual support, and the kind of love that emerges when two people help each other become better versions of themselves. Their story had begun with music in an airport and had evolved into something neither could have imagined, a community of learners united by the belief that it's never too late to discover new capacities for growth, creativity and connection. The Rebecca Chen Community Music Academy would continue to grow and serve students for decades to come, but its foundation would always be the simple truth that had emerged from that first encounter, that music, like friendship and love, is most powerful when shared generously and received with open hearts. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.